across Africa, for example. Data is violently expensive in most African countries. Data is a choice that people have to make about whether they're going to buy food or whether they're going to buy data, because it is part of that economic basket of things that people need.
And so what does your work say about the intersection between media in Africa, the media in Europe? Who are the biggest players?
So there's a hell of a big divide there between the connected and the non-connected. The lack of hotspots, the lack of Wi-Fi, the lack of connectivity, and that really fundamentally changes the way you do business. I think the creator economy in Africa is going to boom.
Lisa, thanks so much for agreeing to come and join me for our inaugural episode. We'll be breaking down, the relationship between the media in Europe, the media in Africa, and looking at how that affects a number of ways the two continents interact with each other. Now, with us today, we've got Lisa Macleod from FT Strategies, who has very kindly agreed to take the risk to join me for this inaugural episode. We'll be looking at the media in Europe, the media in Africa, and examining how that shapes the relationship between the two regions from a variety of perspectives. Now, Lisa, you've got a really empirical approach to this. You're like the numbers lady.
Georgia, thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very happy to be here. Yes, I am South African and also have a UK passport. So I'm a bit of both of those things. So I do sit quite comfortably between these two continents of Europe and in Africa in many ways. I was born in South Africa. I've spent about 25 years in England altogether. I have worked for many years at the Financial Times in London, and my current role is as director and head of our news clients at FT Strategies, which is the Financial Times' consulting division or consulting arm. We're a specialist media consultancy that works for the FT, and I spent many years at the FT and in the FT newsroom as well. But my current role really involves me doing a lot of consulting, a lot of work with publishers around the world, and that includes many clients and friends and colleagues in Africa, not only in South Africa, but elsewhere on the continent as well. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion today. I have a huge interest in the African market specifically and what that means for journalism. I've got a really big and ongoing concern about how journalism is going to survive in certain areas of the world, and one of those areas that I do worry a lot about is the African continent, for a number of reasons that we're going to talk about today.
So the premise of this series is looking at the media. And one of the things that I have encountered is that depending on who you speak to, saying the media means some very different things. When I say the media, does it mean to you?
I think the media is any form of consumption of entertainment or news content. So the media for my dad, for example, is going to be primarily television, because he's never going to be really on the internet. The media for my daughter is somewhere between ChatGPT and YouTube. She's 13 years old. The media for me is somewhere between the occasional newspaper, Instagram, Twitter, the BBC, the FT, number of different news websites. So I think anything that is publishing, broadcasting, or somehow making available to the general public information or entertainment in some way, I would consider the media. I mean, we would say we're in the attention economy now. So anything that takes up your attention, whether it's in the form of entertainment or in educational content or in news content, that really covers a broad spectrum. But I would say that's media very broadly, somewhere between social and television.
And so what does your work say about the intersection between media in Africa, the media in Europe? Who are the biggest players? Who are the standout cases, countries? Give us a bit of a landscape view about, how you look at this as somebody who comes at it from a very research-based, empirical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. There is definitely some crossover in these markets. You will find big European players, for example, in the African market. I mean, Ringier springs to mind with they've got Pulse in Nigeria. We've worked with them quite substantially, and some absolutely amazing products in the Nigerian market, for example. The places like Canal Plus, for example, very, very present in Francophone Africa. So there's definitely a lot of European investment into the African space. But it's the big African independents, I think, are the ones that I find really interesting, because there is such a thriving media industry and such a strong focus on media, whether that is broadcast or legacy newspapers and digital, that are homegrown out of the continent. And the biggest players among them are very fortunate to work for News 24, which is part of Media 24 in South Africa, that is owned by Naspers, now called Prosus, which is often referred to as one of the biggest internet companies nobody's ever heard of, because it's quite sort of under the radar, but the valuation on it is absolutely enormous. I think it's about $56 billion or thereabouts in terms of market valuation. A huge influence on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and that is really a media company that is sort of born and bred in South Africa media company. Moving up, we're going to talk a little bit about the strongholds in the region. We think about the Nation Media Group, also one of my clients, great friends of ours. We've done a huge amount of work in Kenya. That is probably the biggest independent media house in Africa, certainly the biggest in East Africa. A lot of ownership changes there most recently, but very big, solid holdings over that area as well. So, there's not much difference in terms of the structure of the big European companies and the big African companies. I think what is vastly different is the market contexts in which they operate. And I think we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that, and how, what you learn, or what you do as a media company in Northern Europe is going to be very different to the kind of media company running in the African environment. And that is largely because of all of the factors like data costs, infrastructure, connectivity, literacy levels, GDP, levels, et cetera. We can delve into that a little bit.
But before we go into the comparison, just just remind us of what the structures are like in Europe as well, just kind of briefly.
Let's talk about market context, and I could maybe make this feel a little bit more personal. Working in the UK for many years, and working in a very big, well-resourced news organization in the UK, when we thought about our listeners, readers, viewers working out of the UK market, we thought of people primarily with like top of the range iPhones, almost ubiquitous Wi-Fi, the prices falling virtually on a monthly basis for what it cost you to have fairly fast broadband in your house, or broadband or Wi-Fi connections. A lot of competition in the market to provide those services at a very low cost. A highly connected society. I mean, it's very unusual to be anywhere in Europe where you don't have connection or a Wi-Fi hotspot or some kind of connectivity available to you, whether it's a public Wi-Fi or whether it's an ability to just log on and pay for something very quickly to be able to get connectivity. But really, the vast majority of people in Europe would be able to just go onto their mobile data and use it because they have the affordability to be able to do that. Fast forward to jumping from that market to returning to South Africa. This was in about 2014 or so. I had gone from being a completely iPhone focused marketplace to being an entirely Android focused marketplace. So that was one of the first big changes that you would notice. Android phones are far and away the more popular operating system across Africa, for example. Data is violently expensive in most African countries. There are certain African countries where data has become a lot cheaper. Nigeria is one of those. But generally speaking, data is a choice that people have to make about whether they're going to buy food or whether they're going to buy data, because it is part of that economic basket of things that people need. Connectivity is something that they have to pay for. It's something that they have to deliberately purchase. It's not available. It's not broadly available. And so the lack of hotspots, the lack of Wi-Fi, the lack of connectivity, you're not going to get 4G and 5G, ubiquitous 4 and 5G everywhere, for example. So, you might get a very thin connection somewhere, and the further away from the big cities you get, the worse it gets. So there's a hell of a big divide there between the connected and the non-connected in that market. And that really fundamentally changes the way you do business, because you've got to think about how you're going to get information across to people. You've got to think about how your sites are built. You've got to think about the heaviness of the data that you're putting forward. You've got to think about things like autoplay video. No South African consumer on a mass market site wants to pick up their phone and have video autoplaying, because all that's going to do is just chew down the data. And that's not acceptable. So they're just not going to go back onto your site again. Okay. So, there are vast differences in the way that you present and structure a news or an information environment, depending.
It's so interesting because I have only very recently been confronted by how much my choices are affected by my ease of access to data, because thank you very much, nameless internet provider who has not fixed my internet for the last 2 months. But
yes, you mentioned this.
I did.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's all of these presumptions about everything from ordering a taxi to entertaining myself, to preparing for interviews, to, I'm like, okay, what's the lowest, to even being online while my husband is also online. I'm like, how?
It doesn't really work very well all of a sudden.
No, I mean, and yet you have an entire continent where
that's operating like that in much worse conditions. Right?
But at the same time, one of the things I thought was super interesting is just how digital first some aspects of access to the media is, or media creation is on the continent, despite these constraints. So, in talking about the market considerations, how does that affect things from the consumer perspective? Like, how does that change what audiences' tastes are, what they want to see? Does that reflect in any kind of difference between African audiences and European audiences?
Yeah, I think it does, and it comes back to, I suppose, the same product choices that are made available to people. So you do get, in my view, a wide variety of different kinds of distribution models that you'll find in the African environment that you wouldn't ordinarily find in Europe. So in South Africa, for example, there has been for many, many years a really vibrant SMS market still. So, people exchanging news, views, prayers, joke of the day, whatever it might be, via SMS services. So they, as part of their mobile contracts, they use their mobile contracts to buy these additional services that are served to them via SMS. And that basically just means that you don't need to be online to get those services, whether that's little news snippets or whatever the case is. That market lasted way, way longer than it ever did in the countries that went very quickly to 4G, 5G, and sort of Wi-Fi and hotspots. So I think the product variation is quite different. We see a lot more distribution on WhatsApp. WhatsApp is ubiquitous because it's quite low data. It's an easy way for people to send things to each other. That brings its own problems as well, and we've certainly seen in the journalism industry over the years real issues arising with misinformation coming through WhatsApp specifically. There was an election in Brazil some years back which really highlighted for the first time the speed at which information travels on WhatsApp, and it's unverified information because it's not coming from a website. It's coming from somebody who is producing news or refactoring news within a WhatsApp group. So you're in an informal kind of news environment by using things like messaging and SMS, for example. But nevertheless, you will definitely see a higher preponderance of WhatsApp as a distribution channel, for example. You will see compression technology. So I'm sure you must have heard of Opera before. I mean, that was in the African markets many, many years ago. And Opera Mini were compressing big websites to be able to get news out to people, but in a much lighter way, for example. So I think there are a lot of product differences because of the audience requirement for cheaper, faster, lighter, more accessible availability of information and news.
And in terms of the content, like the nature of the content, what can you tell us about the storytelling desires, traditions, differences, convergences between Europe and Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some commonalities. I think everybody, no matter where you go in the world, they love local gossip stories, local celebrity stories, local musician stories. I mean, if I spoke to my colleagues in Kenya or Ghana or Tanzania or South Africa for that matter, the politicians are celebrities. So there's a huge interest in local politics and local politicians, and anything that the politicians do would be the equivalent of us publishing something in England about the royal family, I suppose. It's a very similar kind of, a real obsession with human interest stories and that type of thing. So celebrity and film and that is, I think, really, you will see that particularly with young audiences. You will see that everywhere. I think probably one of the biggest differences is when it comes to what we would call quality journalism, as in, the resources needed to do deep investigative work, for example. A lot of the African newsrooms will not have that level of resourcing available to them, or the level of seniority, particularly as this industry has been under so much pressure for so many years. That's part of the problem, is capacity and resourcing to do deep investigative, long, expensive investigative work. You'll see a lot more of that kind of work coming out of Europe, for example. However, there's an additional thing, which is that the news companies themselves in Africa are often under enormous political pressure from the governmental pressure or from advertising pressure. It's soft censorship in the sense of, a government threatening to withdraw advertising, for example, from that particular media house if they continue to pursue that line of questioning or continue to pursue that line of investigative work. And that is fairly common. That's a lot more common. It's very, very tragic, because it means that, the job of the media, which is to hold authority to account, is often eroded in a very insidious way by that soft censorship, which is effectively what it is.
And what about news creators, those not disseminating journalism or their content through legacy media houses? Do they have more license or freedom to say what they want, to play around with the topics, the way that they present it?
Absolutely, and I think the creator economy in Africa is going to boom, because it is a lightweight way of doing journalism. People are free to do whatever they want to do.
What do you mean when you say lightweight? What do you mean?
I mean, unencumbered by the big structures of a media company, right? So it's a really low barrier to entry to become a news creator. You don't have to get an employment contract. You don't have to get issued a company laptop or have a seat in a company. I mean, you can just start publishing whenever you like, and that I think that's going to. I think that's a very, very interesting space. I mean, I think it's a great way for younger people to get involved in, or not only younger people, anybody really, to get involved in the news. Of course, the more traditional, older legacy companies are quite nervous about that creator space, because it flies against the idea of professional journalism. That's the way I'd make the distinction. Professional journalism being, we have a legal team who can go through this. We have an editor who can check the facts. We have, somebody who's going to interrogate that reporter.
Right.
Yeah. So that sort of governance piece is missing from the news creator environment. And I think that makes...
So we're talking about that in Africa, but how is that reflected? Are the dynamics on that side reflected by what's happening in the news creation space in Europe?
Yes, very much. I would say that's probably pretty much the same. But I do think that slightly more flexible economy of news and the low barriers to entry mean that Africa is a space that's very ripe for that kind of kind of creator work. And I think it will be embraced. I think creators, well, we already know that creators will grow and proliferate in the African scene.
What I find so really interesting is how the news creator scene from the African continent has reached out and resonated with not just the African diaspora, but anyone who is kind of globally minded. There's some really, whether it's comedy, whether it's insight, whether it's business advice, creators who I've come across on my little feed in Paris.
Yeah.
I mean, probably they've worked out that I have a specific interest in Africa, but still, it's really exciting to see how the reach of an African perspective that is not bounded by certain presumptions of less,
Exactly.
is allowed to access new voices. But when it comes to on the continent, is there much appetite from the legacy media to jump on that new kind of stream access way to audiences, or is it very like legacy here, news creators here, never the twain shall meet?
Yeah. I mean, I can think of a couple of examples. I mean, the one that's closest to me is the Nation Media Group, and as I said, we've worked very closely with them. I have a huge amount of admiration for the staff and the editors there, and they definitely recognize, and I think many big traditional media companies are recognizing that creators are not really just not influencers. They are news explainers. They are the people who make sense of the news for a different audience. And, whether that's in South Africa or Nigeria or Kenya or wherever it is, the YouTube, TikTok creators are often seen as being more authentic, more in touch with the news and able to interpret things for their followers that the big legacy companies are less able to do, because maybe they haven't embraced these new formats. For example, they don't really understand how to get the news across in a way that is acceptable or palatable to younger audiences particularly. So the particular example I'm thinking of right now, because this happened at a time when I was spending a lot of time in Kenya, was the Nation Media Group. There were a whole bunch of riots happening over a period of time. There were a lot of anti-government riots. The government was making a lot of changes. They'd had a leadership change. And there were a series of Gen Z riots and protests happening across Kenya. And the Gen Z uprisings happened. I mean, these were called the Maandamano protests. We were working quite extensively with the Nation Media Group at the time, and there was one good example of how they used creators. For example, was a wonderful young woman called Hanifa Adan. She's a prominent journalist and activist, and she was a journalist at the time, but was also very much involved in organizing and fronting and being involved in these actual uprisings. So while she's an independent creator, she's a human rights defender, what the NMG realized and the BBC realized at the same time as well is that that it would be really to their advantage to work with her, not only as a key source but also as a contributor to the coverage of those protests, because she was really, really, really involved in the street level activism that was going on. She became the face of those protests in many ways. So it was really interesting to me, because she was involved in the protests, she was an activist, she was a journalist, and she was also a news creator, and she was kind of bridging that what was happening on the street level with the sort of institutional reporting. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So she became quite formally affiliated with NMG during that time, and we know she was doing her job right, because she was actually targeted by paid government bloggers to try and discredit her as much as possible. And, I suppose this is the environment that you're working in when you are a sort of an online first blogger or creator. But the thing I liked about that particular issue is that it was very deliberate, very thoughtful. She was absolutely the right person. And also she was able to report this in a very authentic way, without sort of being one step removed from it. She, and in this case, Hanifa, was right on the ground when all that kind of thing was happening. So it ticks a lot of boxes when you can find a really good relationship like that. But, saying that, I think a lot of legacy media companies are just looking for any bright young thing to come and front their youth coverage. And I don't know that that's always going to be the right answer either.
Yeah, I always question whether this idea that if you have a competent young person doing a job, you have to qualify their contribution to analysis, reporting, whatever, as youth coverage. Because if they are experienced in what they're talking about more than somebody who's older than them, isn't everyone winning? But
it's a very good point, yeah. And I think exactly as you phrased that indicates a lot of tension in this entire creator professional journalism space about who qualifies as a journalist and who doesn't, or who qualifies to have an opinion or thought on the news, or who qualifies to interpret the news, or who qualifies to even do the news. And I think it's really valuable that we're having those discussions.
Who do you think is doing the gatekeeping, though? Because if you have millions of young people around the world, on the continent, on the European continent, in the States, wherever, accessing information to probably in some ways deeper analysis, deeper understanding of some very complex, nuanced issues, through access to news creators, and yet we're still having this conversation about who qualifies as a journalist. Who's putting that line there?
Do you know, I think it's an excellent question. And I think actually nobody is doing the gatekeeping. If you want news and you want to find it from somebody who really appeals to you, you 100% will go and find it. And this is how the creators are growing their massive audiences, because they are going D2C. They're like direct to consumer. There is no middleman. In many cases, there is no subscription. That's a huge advantage. There is no, no stuffiness about it. There isn't actually a gatekeeping layer. You can get your news directly to the people who want it. I think what you've just described is probably the best of all worlds. Somebody who goes deep, really is able to explain things, is very ethically minded or focused, and keeps a really solid grip on the facts. Best case scenario. Worst case scenario, creators, we've got the stats on this, earn not very much at all. I saw some stats recently, maybe 1 month, $4,000, another month, $400, another month, $650, another month, $12,000, very, very lumpy revenue. And the revenue is tied to the virality of the content that they're producing, right? Because obviously this is the attention economy. They are publishing directly to consumers. They're publishing on YouTube. They're publishing on Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat or whatever it is that they're using. The way they get their views up is to try and tap all of the darker side of user needs, as I say, the things that outrage me, the things that make me angry, the things that make me feel like I'm part of a tribe, or make me feel like, that I want to get my blood pumping. And when the news creators are tapping into that, that is where I think that sort of destruction of value comes, because they too, just like the big legacy players, are subject to the same ravaged environment that we're working in, which is, clicks and clickbait and monetization being attached to a business model that doesn't really favor, slow, quality, thoughtful journalism. It does not. It favors highly inflammatory, clickbaity, let me try and make this as prejudiced as I possibly can, tuck into the side that's going to pay the most or give me the most views. And of course that's the antithesis of what we have tried to do in the industry for years and years and years. I'm not being sniffy about it. No. I don't think one is right or another one isn't right actually anymore.
Let's be honest, regardless of when you're looking at it, the incorruptibility of journalists is directly tied to their existential security. If they're not making money, if they can't look after their basic needs, then
they are open to corruption.
They're open to corruption.
Yeah.
So being sniffy about, it's the creators who are the weak link is just a little short-sighted.
It happens, and it happens in the biggest and best organizations. I mean, I can think of, I will not name them, but I can think of 3 or 4 really senior editors right now who have fallen foul of, bribery and corruption and what we call brown bagging, just getting slipped something to change the coverage or adjust.
And you feel that they kind of ended up there because
lack of pay, maybe power corrupting in some way, maybe some form of bribery hanging over their heads, who knows? I mean, people have a past, they may have done something in the past that basically made them susceptible as a journalist later on. So it's not uncommon in the legacy organizations either. It's just that I think the bigger, richer organizations, firstly, will not tolerate that kind of behavior. They pay their journalists well enough to not have to be corrupted. And that is not the case in a lot of African, big African legacy companies where people are very poorly paid to do very dangerous jobs every day. I think that does make them more susceptible to influence.
There's a lot of excellent, amazing journalism coming out of the African continent. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is enough respect for the industry, both within the African continent and from the European perspective? I mean, again, we're only talking about European specifically because the podcast is about Europe and Africa, but we could look at it from like a north-south divide, but
Yep. I think it is more of a a north-south divide, because I think you see very similar problems and very similar levels of sustainability. The metrics that would indicate sustainability in the long term. So sustainable journalism, financially sustainable journalism, are often not present in developing nations, and that incorporates the global south to many degrees. So LATAM, Africa, parts of Asia, these environments don't lend themselves to really sustainable journalism practices. And that is partly because of, as I said, low GDP. For example, people earn less. The macroeconomics of the region are much more pressured. An inability or an unwillingness to pay for journalism, particularly online. I mean, this is why newspapers still survive in these areas. There's still very much an analog, passing on of news, etc., etc. But it is a very different and very difficult environment to work in for many reasons. It's dangerous for journalists. There's no desire to unveil corruption, whether it's in government or in gangs or in organized crime in some of those areas. And journalists just get killed in those areas for doing their work, So I think the rhetoric, the things that people talk about in Northern Europe specifically and the European environment, and things that people talk about in Africa could not be further removed. In Northern Europe, you're going to be hearing people saying, "Oh, we've got a terrible problem. Our churn rate has gone up by 2%, and now we've lost €1 million this year because our churn rate has gone up."
What's a churn rate?
Like a subscription retention, for example. They're going to be talking about the minute detail of what their unbelievably successful paywall looks like. In Africa, you're going to be talking about the fact that you can't hire people because nobody wants to work in the industry. Journalists are lost, injured, killed, jailed, disappeared. That's more common. It's a really violent, difficult industry to work in.
I mean, we are talking about 54 countries. So where on the continent is it easier to be a journalist who actively, openly is committed to holding power to account, and where is it less so?
Where is it less so? Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we've already spoken about East Africa. I mean, I would say that that is an easier environment in many ways, although it definitely has its pressures. I mean, there's definitely governmental interference there too. South Africa is probably the shining light in terms of protecting the press on the African continent, and that is because we have an incredibly forward-looking and very, very robust constitution in South Africa. And the fourth estate is highly protected under that environment. So the freedom of the press, South Africa has an unusually high ranking in terms of Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, and we're very lucky. Has that helped? Has it helped hold power to account? Most definitely. We've got unbelievable journalists, very, very vibrant industry there. Other parts of Africa, much less so, because there's just not as much governance. There's a huge amount of government interference. I mean, there are large swathes of Africa that don't have a really functional press to even speak of. When you think about sort of the Mauritania, Ethiopia, Eritrea, just battling, to cover the news as you would expect that to happen. And also countries that have not managed to make the switch over to digital, that are still very reliant on print. A lot of companies folded during COVID, for example, because they just weren't able to sustain their printing during that time. So because it's economically precarious, it's much harder to sustain those businesses in a lot of countries. There is no government support for the press. In fact, I would go as far as to say many governments throughout Africa would be super happy to see the press fail. It's not in their best interests to have a really robust press. And, that means that it's an uphill battle for proprietors to keep their companies open and keep paying salaries and keep the advertising flowing.
Is there much of a lionization of European press from the African perspective? Do many Africans look to BBC, CNN, France 24, other.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Actually, I think Francophone Africa has had quite a lot of support from the big French media companies, and I think there's been quite a lot of exchange between the French-speaking countries in Africa and France, which is really good, actually. I mean, it really is good, and I think that's helped a lot, particularly in the broadcast area. And as I said, Canal Plus, etc., is now, has a lot of holdings in Africa, so there is some exchange there in the French language, which is pretty good. I've been involved in organizations like the WAN-IFRA, the World Association of News Publishers. They have a division, a branch within the World Association of News Publishers called Women in News. Does an absolutely phenomenal job of upskilling women journalists throughout Africa. So we've done a huge amount of work on, for example, digital training, sexual harassment training, grassroots reporting type of training, governance, business work, all sorts of things. And those are the kind of structures that have really helped to get the presence of African journalists into the European conferences, for them to have a voice and to be seen and heard, and to have a seat at the table. And a number of those journalists, for example, are now sitting on the boards of WAN-IFRA and the boards of Women in News, and the boards of the World Editors Forum. And I think that's really fundamental, just to try and make sure that there is actually a proper dialogue going on. I work with another organization called the Journalism Innovation Leaders course. That's through the University of Lancashire, with Frans van Nel, who's also South African.
University of Central Lancashire.
Yeah, well, it's not Central anymore. It's the University of Lancashire.
That's my alma mater. That's where I did my master's. Yeah. Oh my God, that's so nice to hear it mentioned in this context.
I'm actually a leader in residence with the university, so I spent quite a lot of time there. I'm often up in Preston. That's amazing.
Literally every morning I'd get on a little train from Manchester to get all the way to Preston, do my courses, get on the train back. Oh wow, I'm very proud to know that they're supporting, the valorization of African journalism. Anyway,
very much so. So Journalism Innovation Leaders has been going for 5 years now. and a key tenet of that particular course is to try and bring in people from the global South African market specifically. So we've had people from Zimbabwe, Rwanda, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, all over the place on that particular course. What that does is it gives, the alumni are continuously in touch with each other. They spend a lot of time together during the course and then after the course as well. And there's a alumni now of about quite a few hundred people who've been through that. So we specifically try and bring in people from these other markets because it's so important to firstly get the skills back into Africa, but also to make sure that the European participants see a broader world out there. We're not all functioning. We're not all functioning on the same level. We're really not. And journalism is journalism. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. It's just that it is 25 times more difficult for some people than it is for others. And so I think raising awareness of that continuously actually will help to protect the industry and help to protect our colleagues in those countries as much as possible. That's the intention of it anyway.
Before I let you go, what do you think is the role of the media in shaping Africa's understanding of what Europe represents and Europe's understanding of Africa?
Well, I mean, I think it's a huge responsibility to represent correctly, and Africa has long been really badly treated by the European press. I mean, the African story has been one of famine. It's been one of famine and strife and starvation and lack of progress, and that is war, it's just not a pretty picture that is painted in the European press, because that negative view of Africa feels like maybe it's just not covered well enough to actually bring the really good stories.
I just think it's lazy.
I also think it's lazy because it's so much easier just to cover the strife and trouble than it is to actually cover the good news stories. But I mean, when you do read the local press in Africa and you do see some of the things that are going on and how people are, thriving. I mean, the climate coverage in Kenya is 10 times better than it is anywhere else in the world. Agriculture, climate, innovation. Agricultural innovation, unbelievable, the stuff that's going on. So I think the tech scene in some of these countries is actually amazing, but it's that lack of transferable skills and the lack of flow, I think, between the countries. Why? Because all governments make it virtually impossible to bring people in and out of Africa unless they were on student visas. It's really hard for Africans to travel. It's really, really hard for Africans to travel, any African to travel, to get a Schengen visa, to get into Europe, to get study visas, to be able to come and go. That is almost impossible. And that's just fundamental border policy that makes it so difficult, I mean, for me, that would be an enormously helpful start, would be to give breaks to people who work in the media to actually be able to travel freely between different areas and work across border. I think would be amazing.
Actually, how did you get into this? Into analyzing the media landscape in such granular detail?
I've got 2 passports, and I spend I've spent half my life in South Africa, half my life in the UK, and the rest of my life on the conference circuit in Europe.
Excellent. Perspectives everywhere.
In media conferences for as long as I can remember, since I was in my 20s. So, I've seen and heard it all.
So you were a journalist, you were into the media, or just, how did this...
I started as a journalist in South Africa, and I was a journalist for many years, and then I went more into the media management side and focused on production workflows, transformation, particularly print to digital. So
amazing. One absolute last thing, I'm asking everyone, what is your nerd fact? And what I mean by that is something that you find fascinating, maybe about your profession. It could be anything that you'd love to tell everyone, but it might be a little weird. And actually, it's not weird, because I want to know.
Let me think. I don't think it's really about the profession, really, but my nerd obsession is sourdough bread. That is a huge nerd obsession of mine, and I've never really had a proper hobby because I've never really had time for it. and I've gone really, really deep into, you know, bacterial fermentation and dough.
I'm not even joking. I went through a deep kombucha phase and it nearly crossed over into sourdough because I was like, can these little babies also make bread?
They
But
can. They
then
can.
also time didn't work out. But Lisa, thank you very much. I
Oh,
wish
it's a
you
pleasure.
many well-raised loaves and thank you so much for talking us through all of that. And hopefully we'll get you on another time. Thank you very much. Lisa
Okay,
Macleod
such a
from
pleasure.
S&P Strategies.